want to explain compression. Now, compression confuses a lot of people, not only the way it operates, but how you might use it in various ways on instruments. And there isn't just one way to use it. And a lot of times it gets thrown around that you use it to correct dynamics, but that is only one of many options that you can use compression for. And also, to the extent that we correct dynamics is a little misled. It's not always used to correct poor playing. Sometimes it has to do with the limitations of controlling dynamics within a recorded environment, so to speak. First of all, I just want to talk about what compression is and what the controls are on it. And the first thing I like to talk about is we call it the threshold, or sometimes it's called ceiling. So the fact that sometimes there's more than one term for these parameters also tends to confuse people, because it makes you believe that sometimes you're talking about different adjustments. But threshold and ceiling are essentially the same thing. I like to explain this, that imagine we have, you're going to see my wonderful stick figures here. We have a person, right? And let's just imagine that they're in a room. And let's say this person is, well, if you're like my height, you're not super tall. So if you were in a room with, I don't know, let's say 8-foot ceilings, right? Then, it's possible that with my height, I could have, like, I don't know, I'm a little taller than 5 foot, but I'm just going to use this as an example. 3 foot of what we call headroom, right? Which is headroom. Meaning that there's 3 feet before my head would hit that ceiling. If I had a ceiling that was, let's say 6 foot, then I would only have 1 foot headroom, right? Okay. That doesn't give me as much space between my head and the ceiling. Okay. The way compression works is your signal is not going to start to compress until it starts hitting the ceiling. If I'm going to draw another stick figure here. Let's say I have another person here, and they're hitting, maybe that's me, and I'm at a 5-foot ceiling. My head is hitting the top of the ceiling, right? Or 5'5" ceiling, right? My head's hitting the top of the ceiling now. And if this was the threshold in a compressor, this is the point where the signal would start to compress. Anything below that, so if we're talking about our first example over here with the 3 feet of headroom, right, there's no compression is going to happen, because we're not actually touching the point where we've told the compressor to start affecting or processing the signal. Right? Even with our 6 foot, gave us 1 foot headroom. If we have, right, if I right at the point where we're hitting the ceiling, and what happens if we go over the ceiling a little bit, right? So say, okay, right, so now we're pushing our head through the ceiling. Okay, now we're starting to compress. So we're setting the ceiling where the ceiling height of the ceiling is, and that tells us how much headroom or how much of the signal we're going to start to compress. So this is threshold or ceiling. Okay, let's move on to another parameter on compression. And this one is going to be, it's often labeled as ratio. People get confused a lot by the terms 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 10 to 1, 20 to 1. I would like to look at it more simply than that at first, just to understand it. At some point, I start adjusting ratios by ear rather than concern about exactly if I'm using 4 to 1 ratio or whatnot, kind of using my ear. But I do understand the principle of what a ratio is. So I want to just go back to our ceiling analogy for a second here. So if I have got our stick figure again. Okay. Now if their head is hitting the ceiling, let's just say it's pushing through the ceiling a little bit. Let's consider the material of that ceiling. Okay, so if we have let's say like memory foam, right? Now, what would happen with the memory foam is if we hit that ceiling, our head would push up on it a little bit. It's malleable, it's flexible, right? Memory foam, okay? And we could draw our head here. Okay, so this would be like a lower ratio, 2 to 1, right? That means that we're hitting the point of compression, so the compressor is processing the signal, but it's not so strong that it's not letting anything pass by. So in this case, the memory foam is allowing you to push through a little bit. The signal's pushing through a little bit. What if we used cardboard? Right, cardboard. Okay, so now what would happen is we would probably get, it's a little more rigid, and we're probably going to get this kind of thing happening. Our head probably wouldn't push up as much as it'd be able to with the foam. Right, but it's still a little flexible, right? I could think of this maybe 4 to 1. Okay. Now these materials keep changing as the ratios get higher. Now we're going to move up to wood. Now, wood isn't really that flexible depending on how thick it is, but in most wood that you wouldn't be able to push your head through it. But it's not as strong of a material, right? So there is the possibility that even if it moves, it could just move just a hair, depending on how much force or signal you send to it. It can actually move a little bit. Right? Maybe this is like, 6 to 1 or something, Okay, so now we're going to move up to what was actually really like limiting, what we think of like brick wall limiting. If I think of something, I'm going to draw a thicker line here and just think of concrete. Now, oh boy, our person's not going to be very happy, because if they're trying to hit their head against that ceiling, it's even less forgiving than wood. If wood is going to hurt, then concrete is going to hurt even more. And you're not going to be able to push your head through concrete. It's just not going to happen, right? And you can see I've got thick concrete here too, which even makes it harder, right? And you can start to think of this as like 10 to 1. And these are like the limiting ranges, means no matter where you're pushing the signal into it, that it's not going to exceed that level. Whereas if we go back to the memory foam, right, it's a little flexible. It allows our head to push the foam up, and as does the cardboard, right? So you see, as the ratios are getting higher, it's setting more of a strict point where we're not going to be able to have any flexibility with signals passing past the threshold, okay? Now, another common feature on compressors, and not all compressors have an attack knob. LA2As don't. There's a few that don't, but 1176, the stressor, there's plenty that do. And the attack knob I like to compare to, if anybody has played whack-a-mole. I think my college students called it guacamole this year. Like, guacamole, I don't think that's it. This is me trying to draw a hammer. I don't really know if that looks like a hammer or not. I'm not sure what that looks like. But I'm going to draw our little mole here, right? And he's going to be like, I don't know, if I'm digging this or not. Okay, right? And in the game, right, and you would find these in amusement parks a lot, and they'd have these holes, right? A whole bunch of them. And the idea is that this mole would pop up out of one of the holes, let's say this one, and the trick was to see how fast you could respond and hit it before it goes back down with a hammer. And if you could hit it fast enough, you'd score points and you could win a prize, right? I think of the attack knob on a compressor to operate in a very similar manner, except instead of the mole popping out of the hole, it's going to be a signal, right? So imagine that we have a transient, right? Oh, there comes a transient, right? Okay. So the compressor is going to act like the hammer, and it's going to decide at what point it's going to try to hit that signal or process that signal based on the threshold and the ratio and stuff is going to be how compressed it is. But this decides when the processing takes place, right? So a faster attack setting means that it's going to try to hit the mole as soon as it pops out of the hole, right? It's going to try to be instant. Boom, got you, right? A slower attack time is going to let some of the initial transient through before it tries to hit the mole. There's a couple of different reasons why we might want to choose either one of these. When we're trying to control a signal that has a lot of peaks and valleys in it, acoustic guitars sometimes can be in this camp, where maybe the dynamic range is just too wide and you're getting a lot of transient, but you're not getting a lot of tone from the instrument. Or I would say that the transient is just too sharp. You know, the acoustic guitars are very percussive and bright sometimes, and sometimes the transients are just too much. And so you might want to try to compress or limit the transient so that it's not so peaky and it brings the signal closer together. So instead of the transients and the dynamic range being this far apart, maybe you've lowered the dynamic range to be this far apart, right? So it's not taking up as much dynamic range, okay? People sometimes use this to control players that are inconsistent with their playing, and it can help in those situations. But even with pro players who are very good at controlling their dynamics, sometimes it's just part of the instrument and the recording medium that we do this in order to just to make the instrument sit better in the mix regardless of the player. So a faster attack time is going to be great for this situation of when you're trying to tame this transient and trying to get it to sit better in more of a limited range. Now, there are times where we don't need to worry about that, right? And I think for me, it's not just a black and white where I could say like, oh, I do this with acoustic guitar, I do this with drums. It really depends on the instrument, the sound I'm going for, the musician, the musical context is everything, right? And there's a time when I have this transient. I'm going to use a snare drum as an example here, right? And where I don't want to kill the transient because I want that attack, I want that pop to come through. And if I set the attack too quick, like we have up here where we're trying to tame the transient, it's going to make the snare drum maybe sound a little too lifeless. Or the guitar sometimes, or any instrument, right? It can start to take away some of the percussiveness and the attack of the instrument. And there are times where I'm not really trying to control that transient. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to change how the resonance or the sustain of the snare drum or guitar or whatever reacts. I want to leave the transient pretty much alone. But maybe I'm trying to compress this second half so it brings out more of the second half tone of the snare drum, which is more like the tone of the instrument. I've also used this on acoustic guitar because acoustic guitar, as I mentioned, has a quick attack and a fast release with its sustain. In order to get more sustain out of a guitar or any instrument for that matter, is I'll let the transient pass by. So I set a slower attack time. So I'm not really messing with the transient, but I'm trying to compress the sustain and the resonance. So it gives me more tone, more body, more richness to the instrument. So it doesn't just sound like a plunky instrument. Okay. They're both very powerful. And there's a lot of times with the like electric guitar where I'm not needing to use like a fast compressor to get that chicken pickin', a funky kind of compressed sound. I'm going more for like I don't know, maybe a thicker overdriven sound. I want to thicken up my clean sound. So I'm much more likely to use a slower attack to let the transient come through so I don't lose any of the punch. But then what I'm doing is I'm getting more body in the instrument because I'm compressing the signal after the transient passes through, okay? So this is just the basics of how attack works. I don't have any milliseconds or mathematical numbers or anything that I've memorized for any instrument to say, okay, I'm going to use 20 milliseconds or anything for whatever instrument. I do it by ear, right? I understand what the principle is, and I understand what I'm hearing when I'm adjusting the knob. So I can hear if it's starting to clamp down on the transient too much, and I can hear if it's not clamping down on the transient too much. So I'm playing with this knob a lot as I'm listening to the person play or myself play, and I'm comparing to be able to understand what effect I'm going for, or what the job is, what I'm trying to correct or enhance. And that's really important when you use compression. You have to know why you're using compression, right? Why? You don't just want to put a compressor on while using it. Sometimes I use a compressor and I barely compress it at all. It's pretty wide open. I'm just really using it to run through the circuitry to add a little more depth and dimension to a signal, right? And sometimes it's these other philosophies of compression that I'm using. But I'm always, when I'm adding a compressor, I'm always asking myself, why am I adding this compressor? How do I say that? Compressor. Why am I adding it? What am I trying to do? What is my goal for adding this into my signal chain? That's really important because that informs you of how to make these other steps, right? Okay, so there's one more common parameter on a compressor I want to talk about, and that is the release. Not all compressors have a release knob. Some have like an auto release on them. And they will use what they call program dependent release, which means it's kind of paying attention to what your signal's doing, and then it decides how fast or slow of a release that you will need, which is what a Teletronics LA2A does and circuits that are based on that. But there are compressors, like in the 1176, the stressor, there's a variety of them that do have a release knob. The release knob can be really helpful. One way I like to think of a release knob, so I'm just going to do my best here to draw a stopwatch. Okay. Okay, and let's see. Okay, so imagine we have a stopwatch here. And it's counting seconds. Once that signal hits, imagine we have the transient, right? It goes up. Right, and say we just, we have our compressor. The attack time is set to hit right at the transient. The release button is basically telling, the release knob is telling the compressor how long it should wait until it lets go of the compressor to release the signal back to its normal operation, or allow the signal to be unprocessed, right? Now, where people don't understand this is that the release time is related to the tempo of the music that you're playing. So if I have a measure of music for here, okay, and let's just say we're at 120 BPM. We feel the weight of beat 1, right? It's the strongest beat in the measure. Okay, so every time we hit a beat 1, there's a strength to that. Okay. So one philosophy, and there's going to be a variety of them here, and again, I also do this by ear, but I am paying attention to the tempo and the pulse and the rhythm of the instrument, the subdivisions. Let's just say we have it set so that the release time, it lets go of the compressor at the beginning of each bar. So that way that first beat is back at our regular volume and then it clamps down again. So transient compression goes, let's go. Transient compression, let's go. Right. So we have a repeated pattern here that basically the amount of time I set the release to takes about a full measure for it to release the compression, the processing. Okay. Sometimes we may want to make that faster. So let's imagine that I've got a bass drum and kick happening here. Okay, so this is a bass drum and this is a snare drum. Okay. If the release time is set too slow, then one thing that's going to happen is that the compressor will kick in on beat 1. Okay, but then it's not going to release in time for the snare drum. And the snare drum is going to sound buried or dull or just lower in volume than it needs to. Right? So in this situation, the idea is to set the release time so that the processing is released by the time the snare drum hits. The processing is released by the time the bass drum hits again. Processing is released by the time the beat 4 of the snare drum hits again. And then it's just a continual situation like this. So I listen to this. I listen to this when acoustic guitar players are playing. Let's say they're playing an 8th note pattern, right? I want to listen to the song and figure out, like, do I release it based on the quarter note, right? Do I release it based on the half note, right? In this case, I rarely release it by the bar. It's usually quarter notes or half notes. It really depends on the music, but quarter notes are often my choice for a lot of this. But again, I'm doing this by ear, and sometimes by messing with the release knob, you can create some cool effects and get what's called breathing. And breathing is what we hear when the compressor is releasing, right? It's releasing it, and as the volume is coming back up, right, or the compressor is letting go of the clamping, what we're getting here is we hear like a bit of a volume rise, like it's a bloom sound. And this is what's called a pumping effect, and many people have used this to great effect, including the Beatles on drums, because it creates a really cool sound. And you get that with a heavier compression setting, right, higher ratio, lower threshold. You're really pushing that compressor, and then depending on where you set the release time, you could get it to bloom, and it's a really cool effect. You don't always want that effect though, and you definitely want control over that effect to decide when you want it. Once I get my attack time set, and actually I sometimes do the release and attacks at the same time, where I'm listening to the source, and I'm trying to listen to the song played at tempo. So it's important that when you're setting compressors, that the person that you're recording yourself, that you're playing the actual music that you're going to be recording, because if somebody's playing a song that's at a completely different tempo, it's likely that you're going to not set the release times right. So listening to them and they're playing along to the track as if they're going to record the track, and then I set the release time in conjunction with the tempo of the music, right? That really is the fundamentals of how compression works. Compression isn't nearly as complicated of an effect as it's led to believe. I feel like it's just been expressed or explained in a manner that hasn't been super clear. I hope that this has been clear to you. I'll be making more videos of using compression on guitars and with pedals and in recording environments in the future. If you have any questions or comments about this, please let me know in the comment section. Like my video, it helped my channel. And subscribe to my channel. I'll have a lot more videos like this. I hope you found it useful. Also, I'm at anatomyoftone.com.